Welcome to The American Mind. I'm Charles Kessler. William Voegeli is the senior editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and his recent book is Never Enough, America's Limitless Welfare State, published by Encounter Books. His most recent essay in the Claremont Review is Days of Rage, Years of Lies, published in the summer 2011 issue. Bill, welcome.
Thank you, Charles.
Let's begin by talking about your book. The thesis of this book is that the American welfare state is insatiable. And that doesn't necessarily mean unstoppable, but it means that it seems to have no limiting principle. You can never say enough is enough. Now, it seems to me the first question we need to ask is that a bad thing? And if that is a bad thing, why?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we had a limitless economic growth, not only limitless through time, but limitless in amount, you might take the position that, you know, it's maybe not such a big deal that the welfare state gets bigger and bigger. If the economy gets bigger and bigger, faster and faster while that's happening, then we can afford this without too much grief. This doesn't seem to be the pattern, even as we look at American history or more broadly. The tendency in every advanced democracy with a welfare state is for the welfare state to grow in both absolute terms and also relative to the size of the democracy. So its expenditures take up a sort of a bigger and bigger footprint on the nation's gross domestic product.
Now, couldn't you argue, though, that as states become wealthier, they can afford more of a welfare state?
Yes, they can. But what happens is that I think this is where we get out of a pure economic discussion into a discussion of political economy. When the political habits inculcated by the welfare state, by its rhetoric, by its programs, convince people that what it bestows on them is done as a matter of right and entitlement, then there's really sort of no reverse gear or pause possibility when the broader economic circumstances indicate the wisdom of even a temporary curtailment. These things are moving ahead. We were promised we would get these benefits. We were told that this was not charity. This entire basket of welfare state benefits was ours as a matter of right. In a sense, democracy curtails its own scope of possibilities. The polity can no longer sort of deal with this emergency or this state of affairs, this pause in economic growth as we're experiencing now.
Is it your assertion that the welfare state in Western countries, and including the United States, has grown beyond the consent of the governed? Is that the problem? Or has it grown beyond an economically optimal size? Or what exactly is it that's wrong about this hypertrophy of the welfare state?
It seems like a collective action problem. People believe that the welfare state as an entity is too big, that government is too big, but they also believe that their particular list of claims upon the welfare state, which means upon their fellow citizens, is fully justifiable and just about right. That contradiction at some point becomes
hands off my Social Security.
Yes, that's right. This is
sign said at a Tea Party rally.
Yes, and of course the Tea Party's critics mocked the stupidity of the people who said such things. But in fact, those signs show that people have been paying careful attention to the lessons being taught to them over the decades by the welfare state and its advocates. when they were told for years and years after the start of the Social Security program that this is your money, this is not this you were these this is not a government check that's being sent to you. It's an account that was opened up with your contributions.
Right.
Well, people felt
it has your number on it.
yes, that's right.
Which you're not to use for any other purpose.
No, people should certainly be forgiven for understanding the welfare state's work in the terms it has been explained to them. So I think that the danger becomes that that our capacity for self-governing is steadily eroded. That we lose what Eugene Sturl of the Urban Institute calls fiscal democracy. That so much of what the government does is locked in by laws passed decades ago, and the political correlation of forces that holds those laws sacrosanct in a way, then, I mean, in a strange way, I think the damage is at least as much to the liberal project as the conservative one at that point, because there's no latitude for government to do anything but the big entitlement programs that have been in place for decades.
Bill, you mentioned that welfare state benefits are conferred, at least nominally, as a matter of right, as you say, not of charity. Now, let's talk about that a little bit. Is that an important distinction, and how does it lead to a reconceptualization of what rights are in modern American politics and in modern liberal politics?
2 points. First, one of the important political battles of the 1930s, of the New Deal, was this takes us to an era in sort of America's political psychology that's very different from the one we've known all our lives. But the government had to work hard to convince people on just that point, that receiving government benefits was not a shameful thing, that they were not freeloaders. And so, in particular, the Social Security Act went to elaborate lengths with its social insurance structures to convince people that there was no need to feel that they were not pulling their weight, that they were second-class citizens who were dependent upon the charity of others. The other point I would make, and it's one that I devote a couple of pages to and never enough, is that that is a marvelous phrase that has been a staple of liberal rhetoric for many decades now, that we should do something, we should give people health benefits or educational benefits as a matter of right, because it's a very astute dodge. It can be heard in either of two ways. If you are still apprehensive about the idea that these are rights claims that welfare state program enrollees have on the rest of us, well, that's a kind of unsettling thing, because the liberal capacity to come up with new rights that need to be addressed with new programs is also, as I think we agree, seemingly boundless. One of the alphabet soup agencies in the 1940s advised that the proper social contract should recognize henceforward the right to rest, recreation, and adventure. And so if people led lives that were insufficiently restful and adventurous and so forth, that this was a deficit that the government was entitled to address. But if you say that you're doing something as a matter of right, that can also be heard as saying, well, we're going to pretend that it is, even though we sort of say that it isn't exactly. So the unsettling part of this rights argument, don't worry, we're not going to push it too far.
Yes, it's hypothetical.
Yes.
In that mode, as if it were a right.
Yes, that's right.
As opposed to the assertion this is a right.
Period. Yes.
Right. Which you have a duty, poor slub, to fund and provide.
That's right, because in an economy where the government takes money from some, disperses money to others, the ultimate meeting of the claim that there is a right to a welfare benefit means that whatever person is experiencing a deficiency in his life on some account, doesn't have enough health care, education, housing, clothing, then that person, by virtue of that unhappiness, has a stronger claim on your surplus income, you, Mr. Joe American, who don't fall into any of these categories, than you yourself do.
Yes.
Well, that didn't please a lot of people. So it was necessary, I think, to find a way to say, well, we kind of mean it, but we don't really mean it.
Because that way is the road to serfdom.
Yes.
Basically, you have all duties, and whatever rights you have seem to vanish in the face of the duties to provide for other people's
yes, the
rights.
Your true rights are not yours by nature. They are entirely provisional and subject to permanent revision as social needs dictate.
Right. Now, the new theory of rights that powers the welfare state, the liberal theory of rights, if you'd like to call it that, begins with a critique of the old kind of rights, the individual rights that one finds in the Constitution, and before that even in the Declaration of Independence, natural rights as they are called. Are you at all sympathetic with the liberal critique of the older rights? I mean, part of their critique was that they were too individualistic or too selfish, too one-sided. And the argument was that in modern times, society is not atomistic or individualized anymore. It's cooperative. We have huge corporations now emerging at the turn of the 20th century and so forth, and we've got to get with it. We have to have a new view of rights that reflects the new realities of our time and so forth. Now, are you sympathetic with that? Or do you think that the natural rights philosophy of the American political tradition of the founders is too selfish, too egoistic, too greedy, or do you think they were simply all wrong about that?
I'm sympathetic with it to this extent. I think that prudentially, the most important words in the English language, it has been argued, are up to a point. And that, in a sense, Is
that true of their importance?
Also, yes, that's right. And so I think that as it happened, the progressives who in the late 19th century began to challenge the 18th century understanding of natural rights had an excellent, for their purposes, foil in the social Darwinians, who really did push the logic of natural rights, of laissez-faire, of whatever comes from market processes as being morally legitimate, and any deviation from that as being lamentable. I think that the progressives did well to have such adversaries, and would have done better still had they said that the social Darwinists have taken a fundamentally sound idea and it stretched it to the point at which it becomes dangerous and unstable, really, theoretically. Instead, they said that the social Darwinists have shown us the logical and necessary conclusion of sort of Madisonian thinking, and therefore, if we reject social Darwinism, we must reject the Constitution, the founding. This, I think, is where the dichotomy posed to Americans in a little over 100 years ago was, in a sense, too stark. The middle position that needed to be developed was left unattended.
And does that mean that, I mean, Darwin and Darwinism, of course, those are difficult, complicated concepts to unpack in a way, because there was left-wing social Darwinism,
yes,
as well as the kind of individualist version that you speak of, Woodrow Wilson being a case in point of someone who boasted of his allegiance to modern Darwinism.
Yes.
But if you grant then that they may have had a foil, but they had a useful and appropriate foil in social Darwinism. So what was unarticulated was somehow the genuine position of the American political tradition. Well, why was it unarticulated?
I don't know. I think that, in a sense, part of the problem may have been that it was so woven into the fabric of American political life that its defenders found it hard to sort of get the proper perspective, to stand back and think of the natural rights arguments of Jefferson and Madison as something that could be sort of reintroduced into the political debate. They were more likely simply to be invoked in a manner of paying deference to the nation's founders, which is important in a sense, but does not QED settle many arguments.
No, right,
you know.
Right.
So I think that at least part of the answer to that is that we went through a period where we both people who basically favored and people who basically opposed the theoretical logic of the American founding lost touch with it in some ways, and that sort of reconsideration, the effort, as the Straussians say, to understand the founders as they understood themselves, was not an element to the degree it should have been in the crucial political discourses of that era.
Right. As you argue in your book, to some extent, the vocabulary and the concepts needed to defend the founders' understanding had atrophied in a way. I mean, you talk of the replacement of nature by history as a key turning point in the evolution of the modern welfare state and of modern liberalism. Say, what do you mean by that? In what sense are we, or were they all progressives in truth and advertising? They really were believers in progress. But what in believing in progress, what were they believing in?
Yes. Well, it seems because Americans during the era after the Civil War were living through such profound changes in so many levels, there was, I think, a receptiveness to the idea that 1776, 1787 were a long, long time ago. We're in a very different country, era, world now. And so arguments that sort of borrowed from without, it seems to me, fully working through the heritage of Hegel, we're able to say to Americans, the fundamental reality now is the shape, the contours of historical change. If you want to really grasp with the things that will determine the kind of lives we lead, the kind of country we have, this is the thing to manage. This rights talk from the late 18th century, that was good in its day. So we sort of used the notion of progress, the notion of capital H history being an entity, to sort of relativize the American founding. And once you do that, then you sort of pave the way for an argument that that says that there's no need to be particularly preoccupied with these questions of what nature intends, what our rights are, how they are to be correctly adjusted in a large society. And I think you then wind up with a sort of, as we've discussed in other contexts, a living constitution. That there's nothing more profound, more important than what we want now, than our sense of what ought to be done. And there's nothing to appeal to beyond that.
You speak in your book of the liberalism's need for a theory of rights, and at the same time their caution, their aversion to a full-blown theory of rights. Why? Or can't they, they can't live with it and they can't live without it? Why?
They, believing themselves to be the friends of the future, the more advanced, anti-retrograde political force in America, they necessarily believe that their agenda, their outlook is astute, theoretically rich, plugged into subtleties in a way that their conservative opponents are not. So it's somewhat, on that basis, there is a feeling that, yes, we really should, there ought to be some sort of theory that explains all of these things we're doing. At the same time, as soon as they begin to construct that theory, they find it confining. Once you say, for example, here is as for example John Rawls did, here is the argument of what the welfare state ought to do. Even as vast as that argument was, there were certain limits then on beyond which the welfare state ought not to go. That's confining in a way. That circumscribes the latitude, the policy making, the editorial writing latitude that they feel more comfortable with. So there's
even Paul Krugman is chafing.
Yes, there's a pull in the other direction that says, we don't want to exactly admit that we're just making it up as we're going along, but we are just making it up as we're going along. That's the real essence of liberalism. You sort of it's good sense. It's entirely tactical. It's in no way strategic. We're dealing with the situation. It's people of intelligence and compassion and good hearts who are trying to wrest the best situation they can out of the hand they're dealt.
But is the theory they're searching for embarrassing because it amounts to no more than claiming that there should be no such thing as an unsatisfied passion, or or at least any need
and any want
that you
becomes
have.
a need.
Perhaps not a want, but any need you have. If you cannot satisfy it yourself, ought to be satisfied socially somehow, at someone else's expense, if necessary.
Yes, I think when the liberal project is reduced to a series of axioms, they're pretty paltry, and people who wish to think of themselves as sophisticates find it hard to look at this list and think, gosh, so that's what I'm for? That doesn't seem, but nevertheless, without any sort of theory other than it's good to have more of just about everything. There are no finite claims on other people's wealth if there's a plausible case that you have a more acute need for what they've got. That's about where you end up. And there have been, there's a communitarian element to trying to explain how all of this works together. There's a sort of what some people have called adhocracy that sort of is involved. But none of these arguments, when you spell them out, really hold up in a way that seem designed to persuade people who aren't already fully committed to the project to begin with.
Right. And as you were saying earlier, liberalism used relativism against the old natural rights philosophy in the founding. But what is happening now is liberalism is being used against liberalism. Relativism is being used against liberalism.
Yes.
That is, so the attempt to ground any of these theories in something that objectively distinguishes wants from needs is subject to the relativist attack. So you say those are your values.
Yes.
But is there any cosmic or historical or any kind of rational grounds for these distinctions? And I think the cultural direction of liberalism is towards no as the answer to that question.
No, I agree. It's a once you start down that road, it's very hard to stop. And since the progressives' ideas of a century or so ago that history had a knowable, discernible direction and destination is pretty well jettisoned, then a good many people are more or less acknowledging that liberalism is just what some of us who believe ourselves to be good folks want to do. And that's as far down as you go. If you try to establish a firmer foundation, it's a futile effort.
It's scandalous, but it's true. I mean, in the academy, one sees this quite a bit, that philosophy is what philosophy professors do and what they say they do. And the same seems to be true for every serious subject. It's whatever those who know and who are supposed to know say it is, you know, and it's a kind of a giant Ipsy-Dixit, you know. If you don't believe this, then there's nothing. There really is nothing beyond that.
Yeah. So the circularity of that argument is simply there's a kind of invulnerability to it. It's at the same time it's inane.
A kind of absurdity to it too. Now, another very interesting part of your book goes not to the theoretical problems in liberalism, but to the practical problems of, as you say, making payroll. That is, it's hard. It's been hard for the liberal welfare state to stay within budget. Yeah. And this book was written and published before the fiscal crisis that came across, not before the collapse of the economy in 08, 09, but before really the politics of Western Europe and the United States had turned to a new crisis of the welfare state, namely, we can't afford it, it's broke. So your prescience has been confirmed, as it were. But what is it why is it that the welfare state is insatiable financially and fiscally, as well as in its moral claims?
I think it's because all welfare states are in democracies, and democratic leaders feel much safer politically telling people about the good things the government will do for them than about the unpleasant things government will require of them. So the description of, the understanding of the welfare state's benefits always tends to run a couple of GDP points ahead of the tax burden that people have been prepared to accept. This is especially acute in America, it seems to me, where the one area where liberals remain chastened by the natural rights heritage is that they are very reluctant to go to the American people and say, look, we have this agenda for a bunch of programs, some of which are already in existence and need to be expanded and strengthened, others of which we've been wanting to do for a long time and need to inaugurate. If we can enact this agenda, it's going to make America a much better place, more economically secure, more united in a way. This will be good for our country. To pay for this, it's going to take a lot of money. We could get some of it from the big corporations and rich people, but only some. If this thing is going to work, we need all of you to pay considerably more in taxes through something broad-based like a value-added tax. It seems to me that such a liberal argument would be intellectually admirable and politically suicidal. And the very fact that nobody ever attempts to make this argument, I think, is the best indication that liberal politicians, and not merely politicians, but even editorialists and columnists themselves do not sort of say, well, here's what we ought to do. We need a value-added tax. In the European context,
is it unimaginable to you that they would make that argument? I mean, Europeans made it at some point.
They did, yes. I think
why wouldn't we?
Yes, I think it is. Well, No, unimaginable would be too strong. I think that we still, even this weekend as we're speaking, there's sort of a push come to shove aspect to the question of how big government should be, how much money should be allocated for it, as the debt ceiling crisis plays out in Washington, D.C. But that's a skirmish in what's going to be a long, long battle as this question gets resolved. The liberal hope is that Americans deep down are so attached to the sort of crown jewels of the welfare state, Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, some other programs, that if they become persuaded that those programs are in jeopardy without higher taxes, they will finally acquiesce in those kinds of tax increases. What is interesting, however, is again that liberals, the liberal hope seems to be that the American electorate will spontaneously arrive at this conclusion, sort of by osmosis, that they'll wake up one morning and say, you know, we really need to raise the taxes in this country. I'm going to write an email to my congressman before I go to work this morning. There seems to be no willingness within the Democratic Party, or the New York Times editorial page, and any of the important tribunes of American liberalism, to go to the American people and say, we need more money for the government to do the things we want it to do, and that means we need more money from all of you. The kinds of tax increases we could impose on the wealthiest citizens or on the big companies, it will help, but not enough. In the absence of that, it seems to me that the sort of liberal project always has a fairly low ceiling on what it can accomplish in our country, and it seems to me that there's, in a sense, the strongest testimonial that one could get as to the proposition. I heard a few people voice it after the 2008 election. That America remained a center-right country. I thought at the time, well, that sounds much more wishful than analytically sound. But I think it's held up better than we could have guessed. The fact that both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, campaigning for the Democratic nomination in 2008, felt it necessary to promise that if elected president, neither of them would raise any federal tax on any American making less than $250,000 a year, which means 97% of the American people, tells you, I think...
You mean the group defined as millionaires and billionaires who make over $250,000 a year?
Yes. So some fundamental math points seem to get on. But leaving that aside, in a sense, and some liberal, a handful of liberal critics have tuned into this point, there really was an admission implicit in those promises that most Americans don't think all that highly of the welfare state, of big government, because the implicit message from Obama and Hillary Clinton in 2008 was, these things we want the government to do, they're worth having, provided somebody else pays for them. We're more or less accepting that you understand that they're not worth having if you have to pay for them, even if you have to pay a little bit more for them. So this is...
but the pain, we wouldn't come to that fork in the road for a while. I mean, the politics of liberalism, it seems to me, are open to presenting in the last extreme. You know, we've either got to turn towards a more socialistic economy or towards a less socialistic economy, and we'll postpone that decision as long as possible. But if, as you say, we can't pay for the basic welfare programs necessary for human dignity in the country, then we really have no choice but to turn towards a bigger government, more punitive in its taxation and so forth, and towards a more left a left-wing social model. It's not, therefore, really, it's not our wish, of course. It's not our. This is just a painful necessity that history has thrown up for us to deal with. I mean, I think that's very plausible and even probable at some point down the line.
Well, it's certainly plausible in the sense that you have the sense that most astute liberals, if you sort of got them off camera, off microphone, off the record, would say, well, yeah, of course.
Maybe with a stiff drink or two in
yeah,
them. Yes,
everybody knows that, that the things we want to do, that we need to do, that a decent society requires, can't be funded on the relatively slender tax base that we've relied on so far. We need to broaden that. But that's, you know, the example, the haunting example of the last guy who tried that is Walter Mondale in 1984.
Yes.
And so we've got 6 election cycles now where people have said, well, I'm not going to make that mistake. If I lose the election, it's going to be for some other reason.
Honesty is not always the best policy.
Yes.
As it turns out.
Yeah. But even if you are honest, I mean, so, you know, I sort of used to think before the crises besetting welfare states worldwide that that there was this fundamental distinction then in that at least in Western Europe, there was this better alignment between what the welfare state offered and what it required of citizens. But that doesn't really seem to be the case anymore either. Even if even if you have taken the trouble under a different sort of political culture to go to the people as a politician and say, look, we need these high taxes to fund this generous welfare state. There's still this, it seems like, chronic tendency for the generosity of the programs to run ahead of the revenue basis that people provide. So it seems sort of no matter where you pitch this question of what's the right size of government, the amount of taxes will always be smaller in a democracy than the amount of revenue commitments that you've taken on.
But to come back to a point you alluded to earlier, it does seem to make a big difference that in the United States we have elections every 2 years. I mean, this gives liberalism a much shorter leash than in parliamentary systems as those that obtain in Europe, where your government may last, 4 years, 5 years, and conceivably in some places longer, and you don't have to go back to the people in that stretch. So you've got your creativity can run riot, or at least can run has a much wider writ than in that of a politician in the United States, where and this has been the bane of liberalism. I mean, when Obama had sort of 2 years to make his move towards much bigger government, Bill Clinton began his first 2 years. He tried also to create a gargantuan healthcare program and to balloon the size of government, but was jerked back immediately in the 1994 elections, just as Obama has been. I mean, this is an occupational hazard of being a liberal, that you're not going to have a lot of time to accomplish your major goals of state building.
That's right.
Since that is the major goal.
Yes, it took the extraordinary circumstances of the 1930s for things to be different.
Yes.
Then you had I think the modern record, a 14-year run from the 1932 elections to the 1946 midterms, where the presidency, the House of Representatives, and the Senate all were under Democratic control. And in fact, I was, in another context, I was looking this up yesterday, between 1900 and 1980, that was actually sort of the norm. I think for 56 of those 80 years, or 75%, the White House and both houses of Congress were under the control of the same party. Since 1980, there have been, if we go up through the 2012 elections, in those 32 years, there have only been 8 years where all three were under the same party. So there's been a kind of, the electorate has been hedging its bets, I think, in a way that it wasn't for most of the 20th century. And certainly one thing that comes for this, we recall the
but even when you have one part, unified government under one party, it's still, I mean, the 30s are still the only case where the margins of that control grow with each election. Isn't that true? I mean, 3 elections in a row? Is
32, 34, 36.
Yes.
Yes, I think that might be.
Yeah. I mean, from a certain point of view, the 30s really are an anomaly. I mean, even Lyndon Johnson had his run from 64 to 66, basically, but after that election, I mean...
Yes, he lost, as Michael Barone says, he lost his Great Society majority, at least in the House of Representatives.
That's right.
And I think the 30s are an anomaly in another way. Liberals nostalgic for the New Deal are nostalgic not only about the policy, but about the politics of that era, the way things were done. During the first 100 days in 1933, Americans really experienced, maybe for the only time in modern history, what it would be like to live in a parliamentary system, because you had President Roosevelt basically passing bill after bill and a legislative agenda to Congress that approved it almost immediately, perfunctorily in some respects. The people were, this was partly out of partisan enthusiasm, but partly out of grave fear about the economic consequences. So even if people had misgivings about particular policies, they said, well, we've got to do something. As FDR had said in 1932 at Oglethorpe University, above all, try something. And on that basis, people pretty much green-lighted everything he sent up. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah,
except the Supreme Court. The only body to say no to him was really the Supreme Court.
Well, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Bill, let's switch subjects a little bit and talk about conservatism. We've been talking about liberalism. One of your book's point is that the conservative critique of the welfare state has not made a big difference. It has not prevented the welfare state from expanding as it has expanded and from experimenting as it has experimented. And among the varieties of conservative speculation or criticism, let's say, about the welfare state, you are especially severe on the libertarians. Both their, you object both to the character of their arguments and you point out the ineffectiveness of those arguments. Now, why do they draw your special ire?
Yeah. Well, I think that to be engaged shrewdly with the world of politics means to understand that having a set of axioms and principles is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for making the world better or preventing it from getting worse. And there is, I think, within the libertarian approach a refusal to sort of recognize this, a belief that a purist position is, in a sense, that political ineffectuality is a kind of badge of honor. That if you're not getting anything done, if you're taking a position that can't possibly secure an electoral majority, that proves that you are the sort of serious, committed, principled person who's really too good for this sordid political world.
I think, therefore I lose.
Yes, I think that's a part of it, and so I think that, and it's also, I think, in a way, I mean, another part of my.
So you're saying that they're unpolitical or anti-political in their mode of thinking?
Yes, I think there's a kind of disgust with the moral shortcomings of people who would accept the establishment and growth of a welfare state. And other than sort of saying to them repeatedly, turning up the volume dial ever louder, well, you have to, don't you understand that you have to abandon this horrible imposition, this thievery from taking from some people and giving it to others. There's not much to sort of persuade there. I think it's.
But is that? I mean, let me explore that briefly. Is that in part, though, an objection to what you might call the populism of libertarianism? Because don't you hear the same kind of objections against the Tea Party, which is not? I mean, it may have libertarian tendencies, but it's not per se a libertarian movement. That they, they're not realistic. They're either or reasoners. They're not compromise. They're not open to compromise. Is this to what extent is this a libertarian problem, and to what extent is it a problem with any kind of conservatism that is genuinely populist?
It may not be the defining characteristic of libertarianism, and it's a problem that I think can be shared by other approaches, both on the left and the right. Really, I mean, there's you look at something like the Progressive Congressional Caucus, which kind of sort of takes the same approach. That if you're not serious about becoming social democrats, then there's really nothing we have left to say to you. But I also think that. Insofar as the libertarian critique of the welfare state is a dominant feature of the conservative critique of it, that it's ill-advised and unfortunate to concede no democratic and historical legitimacy to the fact that the welfare state exists. There is, I think, an argument or sort of an implication that the New Deal came about as a result of a coup, and that the decisions people were making in the 1930s simply deserve no respect, that there's no sort of causal connection that helps us make sense of them. And in arguing in this manner, then I think libertarianism makes it difficult for us to do the hard work of stepping back from the mistakes launched in the 1930s, rather because.
But you call them mistakes, or at least some of them mistakes.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the New Deal is not a coup, but still don't you have to distinguish between the reality of the welfare state? And indeed, the historical roots of it now, which make it very difficult to thin or transplant or to do anything major to. That still raises the question whether the welfare state is a necessary evil that you can't do away with, or a positive good. I mean, or is it something genuinely good and beneficial and something that we should not worry about extending and experimenting with?
Yes, my own feeling is that.
Where are you on that question? Is the welfare state good or evil? To put it in simple terms.
Yeah, good, I would say. In that I pick up Irving Kristol's call for a conservative welfare state in somewhat different terms than he was advocating it, I believe, but nevertheless with the idea that a rightly constructed and sort of rightly defended welfare state can bolster rather than diminish the American experiment in self-government, which I would say is sort of the kind of ultimate criterion of every policy and political development. Does this help sustain or make it more difficult to sustain this effort to govern ourselves, to govern ourselves well. So yes, I mean, if starting with a blank sheet of paper, I would, which history never gives us, I would attempt to come up with a welfare state that helped those relatively small number of people in a modern, prosperous democracy who are chronically unable, despite their best efforts, to fend for themselves. And the still small but somewhat larger number of people who transitionally, given the creative destruction of modern capitalism, find themselves, through no fault of their own, in a declining industry or business or something, and need some help to get to the next thing, to get to the next point in their life where they are able to stand on their own feet. And the explicit purpose of this project would be to secure maximum political support for a democratic capitalism. Yes. So I think that now, of course, the reality is that we don't get to rewind the tape and start over.
Right.
So I think these arguments are useful to help guide us, but in the political reality is that what has happened in America from 1933 to 2011 has happened. And in some sense, even harder task now is to try to bend the most destructive tendencies of the efforts launched with the launch of the welfare state in a direction that makes them less threatening to our attempt to be a sustaining republic.
But I mean, I think your position is interesting because your critique of the welfare state is also a moral critique, though. I mean, you're saying it's based upon a phony notion of rights, or at least a counterfeit notion of rights and duties, and that there's a species of fraud, or at least, let's say, sophisticated bait and switch going on in the moral argument for the welfare state, which turns every putative want into a putative need and every putative need into a right that the state has to satisfy somehow. So can you have a welfare state that rejects that moral ground in favor of a more natural rights basis, which you seem to be calling for? If you have that, I mean, are you not satisfying, at least to some degree, the libertarian demands for a reformed welfare state, or for the abolition of the fraudulent welfare state?
As I understand the libertarian argument, I think the answer would be no. That it seems to me the libertarian position is that a conservative welfare state is a contradiction in terms. That any welfare state necessarily involves the sort of heavy-handed government taking from Smith and giving to Jones that we want no part of. And so it doesn't matter what other theoretical constructs you bring into play here. If that fundamental reality is happening, then you've lost my vote, the Libertarian Party member would tell you.
Yes, no, I understand that, and I think you're right about the general trend of that. But wouldn't it still make a difference if you're talking not about a minimal welfare state? I mean, if you're not talking about redistribution, you're talking about effectively charity, or providing a safety net for those who are actually incapacitated.
Yeah. But I think it's sure. I'm sure a lot of libertarians will say, "Oh, well, that would be a lot better than what we've got now."
Right.
So I'd vote for it on that basis.
Right.
But I still think it matters, and I think people pick up on this. If you're talking about these things as your ultimate destinations or simply your provisional ones.
Right.
I think that the conservative case is against the welfare state suffers in American politics because many people suspect, with good grounds, that all of these the proposed reductions, reorganizations under consideration are all put forward by people who ultimately seek the complete disappearance of these kinds of programs, and it's
Social Darwinism. Again,
yes,
right-wing social Darwinism.
yeah. So I think that in a strange way, I think that conservatives would secure more latitude to rein in and improve the welfare state by saying that they don't want to get rid of it than they would by insisting or not repudiating the assertion that ultimately they do want to get rid of it. It seems to me that if the context of the debate is that every change, every restriction, every new element introduced by conservatives into our welfare state has the ultimate purpose based on conservative theorizing, libertarian thinking, of getting to the post-welfare state America, then it becomes, every one of those steps becomes harder to take politically. Whereas if there is an agreement that we're going to have a welfare state, and the question is about how it will operate, how it will align itself in the most reassuring and encouraging way with our attempts to preserve our republic, and we don't envision under any scenario that the welfare state moving into the dustbin of history, then I think you have a different and a more a productive sort of argument. And it's you know, it's not a matter of it's not as though I think that if we sat down and spoke in this way with Paul Krugman long enough, he would eventually come around to our point of view. But it seems to me that that there's a kind of a sizable swing vote out there of people who are not committed to the libertarian cause or to the social democratic agenda, and who are open to persuasion, and they'll be much easier to persuade if we make the argument that the conservatives seek to improve rather than banish the welfare state. So it seems to me that we conservatives are, in a sense, making things harder for ourselves and easier for our liberal adversaries by not insisting that on what we do and what we don't want to accomplish in this regard.
Yeah. As we're running out of time, let me focus on your own prescriptions for the welfare state. You were beginning to sketch these, moving in a more means-tested direction. Explain a little bit about why you think this is advisable and what the consequences would be for these kinds of changes.
I think that a welfare state that helped people who needed it and did not help people who didn't would require significantly less money, which would be a good thing. But it would also...
How much less?
Well, I don't know how much less. I'm working into that question. I think that at least initially it might not be that much less. I mean, I think the point of means testing a program like Social Security, the way to do it right is to phase it in quite gradually. You can't, if you cut Social Security checks to people who've been saving carefully for their own retirements, you penalize that.
That's right.
And which is precisely the thing you don't want to do. And so I think the sort of approach, the means testing approach that makes sense is to do something like what people were talking about. Not much came of it in terms of legislation. after the 2004 election, when there was some talk of the economist Robert Posen's idea of adjusting your Social Security benefits on the basis of what you earned during the course of your working years, so that if you were provident or if you were improvident, would have no bearing once you turn 65 or on what your Social Security would be. But there would be greater incentives.
But your income would have had a bearing on it. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So it's you are adjusting the government benefits on the basis of people's capacity to pay for themselves, rather than the fact of whether they have done so or not. Yeah, and thereby further giving a negative incentive that will nudge people, as Cass Sunstein would say, in that direction. But I also think that a means-tested welfare state, once you work out the numbers, work out the particulars of the policy, is a politically healthier one, in that it reinforces this idea that we are a society that helps people when they have a real bad patch in their life and need some support, but not one where we encourage people to believe the illogical idea that somehow the government has this magic capacity to, borrow a William Buckley phrase, to blacken the sky with crisscrossing dollars and allow for everyone to magically come out as a net importer rather than a net exporter of those dollars. The liberal argument for the welfare state, for the social insurance state, has traded heavily on this logical impossibility, this sleight of hand. And it's not simply that we have bad and expensive policies as a result, but I think it's politically corrosive. It conditions us to expect the government to do things which it cannot possibly do. It would be more grown up, speak better of us as a nation and a republic, if we approach this by saying we're going to, since we can't have a surplus, since there's no magic wealth creation machine in the basement of the Social Security Administration office building, then we're going to choose carefully about who gets help and who doesn't. And we're going to, and the logical way to make that choice is to say that we're going to means test to give the benefits to the people who are poor, who've had a sudden shock in their life, and not people who are or who should be able to fend for themselves without these kinds of programs.
And so the moral effect would be to refocus the welfare state away from entitlements and on something closer to charity, or closer to aid that is not a general right of a broad category of Americans?
That's right. I mean, there's a...
I mean, you can see why, from the liberal point of view, and maybe other points of view, people would resist that, because you're in effect narrowing the clientele. But everyone is still paying for it, and so the dynamics the dynamics turn to shrinking it or to controlling it carefully rather than enlarging it, because you're not enjoying. Many people are not enjoying its benefits.
Yeah. Well, but I think again the political argument, the logic of it is that in a sense liberals need to recognize that they've changed America in some ways for the better, as they did with the civil rights crusades of the 50s and 60s. As a result of liberal rhetoric and liberal practice going back to 1932, I think there is a fairly robust, widespread understanding now that it speaks well of us as a nation if we devise programs to help people who are in desperate circumstances. And I don't think, and I think we've reached the point where it's no longer necessary to give financial incentives or financial illusions to people to enlist their political support for those kinds of programs, to tell them that you should, not only will this help poor people, but this will help you too, even though it's again not possible for everyone to be a
net recipient,
a net importer of these federally rearranged dollars. No, I think there's I wouldn't say charity exactly. There's a
but you'd be focusing on the 2% or the 10% who really need it,
yes,
rather than trying to give it to 100% of people, so that everyone will feel invested in the program, and that and any moral odor from receiving benefits will be dispelled because everybody's receiving benefits.
That's right. There's a kind of communitarianism, a very cheap sort of kind. We're all getting checks from the same government agency. This is where brothers are.
Yes, socialists.
That's right. Yeah. No, when there was a New York Times article I quoted in the book about 13 years ago, I think. The state of Idaho had taken the Gingrich Revolution to heart, and after the Welfare Reform Act of 1996 was on the books, Idaho had really been at the forefront of curtailing programs and benefits, and cutting its state taxes, and one of these sort of news analysis articles that's more sharply editorial than most things on the editorial pages, appears on the front page, where the fellow quotes academic researcher to the effect that as a result of these policy changes, Idaho is now the worst place in America to be poor.
Is that right?
And I thought it was a telling phrase. One is, it seems to me that it implies that the liberal understanding is that the goal of social policy is to make your state or country the best place possible to be poor. And that understanding of what it means to be a good place to be poor is that poverty is a sort of a sustainable and respectable lifestyle, really. That it's sort of the permanent graduate student kind of approach to life, really, where you have, as you do in Rawls' theory of justice, you have things taken care of for you, and you can sort of pursue your own wants and interests, and whether they're noble or kind of pedestrian. So I thought that was interesting. It seems to me that there is a way in which conservatives can say, we also want our state or our country to be the best place to be poor. But what that means is that we want an opportunity society. We want the sort of economic vigor that allows everyone who can possibly take advantage of those opportunities to climb the ladder, to gain the self-respect and the self-sufficiency that a robust Republican life requires, and therefore we see these programs as helping people over these rough patches and not as ways of life. So I think clearly there's more to be written about this conservative welfare state. It's striking that Irving Kristol himself, though he used the phrase several times, sort of sketched out its meaning. But I think there's more work to be done there, and I hope to get to it one of these days. Yeah.
Thank you, Bill Voegeli, the author of Never Enough: America's Limitless Welfare State. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.